So if I told you to picture a country where women outlive the global average by, like, half a decade,
Mm-hmm.
and where they hold an absolute majority of the seats in the national parliament, and where the maternal mortality rate is just a tiny fraction of the global average, you would probably picture, I don't know, a wealthy Scandinavian utopia, right?
Oh, absolutely. You'd imagine like vast financial reserves, a massive sovereign wealth fund.
Exactly. A sky-high gross domestic product.
Yeah.
You certainly wouldn't picture an island nation with a per capita income under
No,
$9,000.
you really wouldn't. Yeah.
But when we dive into the data today, that is exactly the stark, kind of counterintuitive reality we're confronted with. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, for those of you listening, we're taking this massive stack of data on global development.
And it is a massive stack.
Oh, yeah. We're looking specifically at the Human Development Index, gender equality metrics, and planetary pressures. And we are examining one highly fascinating case study, which is Cuba.
Yeah, and it's a case study that, honestly, it forces us to question the basic arithmetic of global development
Right.
because for decades, the assumption has always been that you just need massive economic wealth to buy human well-being.
Yeah, high income equals high development.
Exactly. But the data we're looking at today, stretching from 1990 all the way to 2023, it tells a completely different story. It asks this core question, why is a low-income country leading the world in what we might call future survivability?
I have to admit, when I first looked at this research, I genuinely thought there was a typo in the spreadsheets.
A lot of people do.
I mean, we are looking at a country whose gross national income, or GNI per capita, sits at roughly $8,400 as of 2023. That is literally about 40% of the world average. It's a low-income reality.
Right, it's way below what you see in the world's highly developed nations.
But then you look at their social indicators,
Mm.
and especially when you adjust their overall human development score for their ecological impact, their global rank just absolutely skyrockets.
It does. They're suddenly competing with, and in some specific metrics actually beating, countries with vastly more wealth.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
So what's our mission today?
Well, the core mission for this deep dive is to dig into the raw numbers and see if that traditional model, this deeply entrenched idea that high income is a totally non-negotiable prerequisite for high human development, is actually just outdated.
Especially in a world where ecological dividends are kind of drying up.
Exactly. The data suggests we might need to completely rethink how a society can prioritize its limited resources. How do you build well-being without a massive economic engine driving it?
Right. I love that phrase you used earlier, future survivability.
Mm,
Because that's what we're measuring, right? Are we building societies that can endure?
exactly.
But before we get to the environmental and gender adjustments, which, spoiler alert for you listening,
Mhm.
completely flip the script on how we view development, we need to establish a baseline.
Yeah, we have to look at the traditional Human Development Index, the HDI.
Right. And for those who might just hear HDI thrown around in the news, let's quickly break down what this scoreboard actually measures.
Sure, so the HDI was fundamentally designed by economists to strip away the idea that gross domestic product is the only way to measure a country's success.
Because GDP is just about money.
Right. It was kind of a rebellion against the idea that money equals progress. So the index looks at three distinct pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
Okay, so health, education, and income. So when we pull up the 2023 HDI data, Cuba reaches a score of 0.762.
Right.
And to put that in context, that is actually slightly higher than the world average, which sits at 0.756.
Which is incredible when you remember they are achieving this with a fraction of the income of other nations in that same scoring tier.
Yeah, they're punching way above their weight class.
And what's particularly crucial to understand here is the historical trajectory, because development isn't just a snapshot, it's a motion picture.
Right, you have to look at the trend lines.
Yeah, and if you trace the data provided in our sources back to 1990, you see this incredibly steady, resilient climb through the 90s and the 2000s. They actually peaked around zero point 0.8 in the late 2000s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. There are fluctuations, of course. Like if you look closely at the graph we have, there's a very specific sharp dip in 2021.
Let me guess. The pandemic.
Exactly. Cuba's HGI drops down to 0.745 in 2021.
I mean, every country's chart looks like a roller coaster right around 2020 and 2021.
It's true. The 2021 dip reflects the severe impact of COVID-19. It's strained global supply chains and heavily impacted economies that are, reliant on international mobility and tourism.
Which Cuba obviously is.
Right. But what you have to look for in data like this isn't just the fall, it's the bounce.
Mm.
The subsequent recovery in 2022 and 2023 bouncing right back up to 0.762, it demonstrates a profound systemic resilience.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there and play the skeptic for a second.
Go for it.
Because looking at this, it feels like balancing a boulder on a toothpick. Like, how does a country with such constrained economic resources manage to keep its HDI afloat, let alone bounce back from a global pandemic faster than some incredibly wealthy nations?
It's a fair question.
We're talking about an economy under severe structural constraints. How is this mathematically possible?
Well, to answer that, we have to isolate the variables within the HDI itself. We have to temporarily set aside the standard of living or the income dimension of the index.
Because we already know that's their weak point. The wealth just isn't there.
Exactly. So when you remove income from the equation, you are left with the other two pillars, health and education.
Okay.
And this is where the Cuban data starts to heavily diverge from global economic expectations. They essentially compensate for a lack of financial capital with an overwhelming investment in human capital.
Let's pull on that thread, starting with health.
Yeah.
Because the numbers here honestly maybe do a double take.
Yeah, they're striking.
We're talking about the first non-income pillar, which is life expectancy. For 2023, the total life expectancy in Cuba is just past 78 years. It's 78.1.
Right. And if you break that down by gender, the divergence from the global average is just wild.
It really is. Like, Cuban women, as of 2023, have a life expectancy of 80.5 years. They've crossed the 80-year threshold.
Which is a huge milestone.
And Cuban men are sitting at 75.7 years.
So let's bring in the global comparison so we can really anchor this data for the listener.
Yeah, give me the baseline.
The world average life expectancy in 2023 is 73.4 years.
Okay.
For women globally, it's roughly 75.9 years. So Cuban women are living nearly 5 years longer than the global average.
That's half a decade.
Yeah, and for men, the world average is 71.0 years. So Cuban men are outliving the global average by almost 5 years as well.
It's half a decade of extra life across the board. But I want to get away from just listing the numbers. How are they actually doing this? Because my assumption, and I think the assumption of most people listening, is that keeping people alive longer requires incredibly expensive, high-tech hospitals, like MRI machines on every floor, massive pharmaceutical budgets.
And that is the Western wealthy nation model of healthcare. It's highly reactive.
Right.
You wait until someone is catastrophically ill, and then you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to save them. The takeaway here isn't just that Cubans live longer. It's that preventative care is fundamentally cheaper and often way more effective on a population level than reactive care.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does preventative care actually look like on the ground there? How does it explain a 5-year leap in life expectancy?
It comes down to system design, specifically something called the consultorio system.
Consultorio.
Right. Instead of building massive, centralized mega hospitals that people have to travel miles and miles to reach, the Cuban system places small clinics, consultorios, in almost every single neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And these are typically staffed by a doctor and a nurse who actually live in that neighborhood, often right above the clinic itself.
Wait, so the doctor is literally your neighbor?
Exactly. And because they're your neighbor, they aren't just seeing you when you're sick, they are conducting annual mandatory checkups. They know your family history, they know if you smoke, they know your diet.
They see you at the grocery store.
Right. So they are catching hypertension before it becomes a heart attack. They're catching prediabetes before it requires, a costly intervention.
That makes perfect sense.
By treating the patient before they become an expensive hospital bill, you drastically increase life expectancy without needing the GDP of a massive industrialized nation.
If you don't have the funds for a massive state-of-the-art repair shop, you just make sure you meticulously maintain the engine of the car you have.
That's right.
You do the routine oil changes, you check the tire pressure every week, so it never breaks down in the first place.
That's a great analogy. In human terms, that means universal local clinics, incredibly high vaccination rates, and just really rigorous community-level preventative care.
And the historical data absolutely backs this up, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't some sudden miracle.
No, not at all. In 1990, female life expectancy in Cuba was already nearly 76 years. They built this structural foundation decades ago and have just maintained it.
Even during all the economic turbulence.
Exactly. Even during the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a time of immense economic hardship for them, The health system was just prioritized above almost all else.
So the data is clear. They are living longer, much longer than their wealth would predict. But, living longer is only half the battle.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, what is the quality of that extended life? Like, are these years filled with opportunity and knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Which naturally brings us to the second pillar of the HDI, the education metrics.
Right. Shifting from physical longevity to intellectual empowerment. And the numbers here again show a really intentional systemic strategy.
Let's hear them.
So for 2023, the mean years of schooling, which is the actual average years the current adult population has spent in the classroom, sits at 10.6 years overall in Cuba.
Okay, 10.6 years.
Compare that to the global average, which is only 8.7 years.
No, okay. So almost 2 full extra years of education on average.
Yeah. But I want to look closely at the gender breakdown here because I think this sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about today regarding equality.
Let's do it.
Cuban women have a mean schooling of 10.7 years, which actually slightly edges out Cuban men who are at 10.5 years.
That is fascinating.
It's a critical mechanism for you to understand. When a country has highly limited financial capital, it cannot rely on brute financial force to advance globally.
It can't just buy influence.
Exactly, and it can't buy its way out of structural problems.
Yeah.
So investing deeply and equitably in human capital becomes the only viable strategy for national advancement.
It kind of makes me think of a bootstrapped startup
I
company.
think, oh, so,
Well, let's say you're a small startup and you have absolutely zero marketing budget. You can't buy massive billboard campaigns or Super Bowl ads to force people to buy your product.
so what do you do?
You focus on the product. Exactly. You take every single penny of revenue you have and you pour it into R&D and employee training. You make sure your product and your people are so undeniably structurally sound that you can compete on sheer quality rather than just financial volume.
That is an excellent way to frame it, and the key word there is equitably.
Right.
Because Cuba ensured that women were receiving just as much, if not slightly more, of this human capital investment as men. They effectively doubled their highly educated workforce.
Yeah, compared to countries that didn't do that.
Exactly. Think about the inefficiency of historical models in other countries that systematically excluded women from higher education. You are essentially leaving 50% of your nation's intellectual capacity on the table.
A low-income country simply cannot afford that kind of waste.
They really can't.
So we have a population of highly educated women living incredibly long lives, which provides a perfect transition into how these metrics combine to create a broader picture of gender equality. Because we've seen that women outpace men slightly in education and significantly in life expectancy. So let's dive into the Gender Development Index, or the GDI.
Yeah, let's clearly define the GDI because index acronyms can get like an alphabet soup really fast.
Please do.
So the Gender Development Index measures the gender gaps in human development achievements. It takes the exact same 3 basic dimensions of the HDI, health, knowledge, and living standards, and it looks at the disparity between men and women within those specific dimensions.
Okay.
Mathematically, the GDI is calculated as the ratio of the female HDI to the male HDI.
Okay, so if the scores were perfectly identical between men and women, the ratio would be exactly 1.0.
Correct. A score of 1.0 represents absolute parity in those basic achievements.
So looking at the 2023 data, Cuba's GDI value is 0.975, and the world average is 0.955.
Right. And this score of 0.975 places Cuba in Group 1 of the global GDI rankings.
What does Group 1 mean, practically?
The UN categorizes countries into groups based on their GDI, and Group 1 comprises countries with the absolute highest equality in HDI achievements between women and men. They are in the top tier globally. It means Cuban women's human development level is at 97.5% of men's.
Wow. And looking chronologically at the sources, this didn't just happen overnight. Like, Cuba's GDI was already an impressive 0.929 way back in 1995.
Yeah, they've been steadily, relentlessly creeping toward that absolute parity of 1.0 for nearly 30 years.
It shows a long-term structural commitment. It's not just a temporary statistical spike caused by, like, a single piece of legislation or a sudden influx of funding.
Exactly. It's a generational systemic trend.
But, this brings up a really important philosophical question.
Yeah.
And honestly, a point of skepticism for me.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if the basic development levels, health, basic schooling, and whatever income there is are virtually equal between men and women, does that mean true equality has been achieved? Because I can easily imagine a scenario where women are perfectly educated and they live long lives, but they are still barred from certain jobs, or they face massive societal discrimination. Like, can we just look at the GDI and say, great, they solved sexism?
Absolutely not. And that is exactly why data literacy, really understanding what a metric does and does not measure, is so crucial for us and for the listener.
Right.
The GDI measures basic capabilities. It measures the tools someone has been given. But capabilities do not automatically translate to freedom.
Right. Having a hammer doesn't mean you're allowed to build a house.
Exactly, nor does it account for the structural barriers a person might face when trying to use those tools. To see that reality, we have to flip the lens and look at the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
Ah, okay. The indices build on each other. So explain the crucial difference between the GDI and the GII.
It's basically the difference between measuring achievement and measuring loss. While the GDI measures the basic achievements in human development, the GII measures the loss in potential human development due to inequality.
Okay, loss and potential.
Right. It looks at 3 highly specific dimensions where women typically face systemic friction: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
I see. So if the GDI is measuring the horsepower of the car, the GII is measuring the friction on the tires and the headwind slowing it down.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. It's designed to expose the structural chains that hold women back, even if they are well-educated and healthy. And because it's measuring a loss or a friction for the GII, a lower score is better.
Right, closer to 0.
Yeah, a score of 0 would mean 0 inequality, 0 friction.
Okay, so I'm looking at the 2023 GII numbers here, and it's honestly making me question how other countries are operating.
The numbers are stark.
Yeah. Cuba is sitting at a score of roughly 0.296. Let's call it 0.3 for simplicity. And remember, lower is better. The global average is hovering all the way up around 0.455. That is a massive delta.
It is a massive difference. In fact, that score means Cuba is about 35% more efficient at mitigating gender inequality than the global average.
35%.
Yeah. It demonstrates that Cuba isn't just giving women health and education. They're actively reducing the societal friction that prevents women from utilizing those tools.
But I don't want to just look at this massive overarching number. The GII isn't just one monolithic concept, right?
Yeah.
It's made up of 3 specific components.
Right.
I propose we break these down one by one. I want to see the actual mechanics of how they achieve this score.
Yeah.
And more importantly, where the data shows they might still be struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Because no system is perfect.
I completely agree. So let's start with the first component of the friction index, the GII reproductive health.
Okay.
This dimension is primarily measured by 2 distinct indicators: the maternal mortality ratio and the adolescent birth rate.
Let's start with the maternal mortality ratio, because this is where the Cuban system's design really shines through again.
It really does.
This metric measures how many women die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. Globally, this number sits at a staggering, honestly heartbreaking, 216 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Yeah.
In Cuba, it is 39.3.
Just think about the scale of that difference for a second. The global maternal mortality rate is roughly 5.5 times higher than Cuba's.
But again, I want to get into the how. How does a low-income country prevent mothers from dying during childbirth at a rate that shames much of the developed world?
Well, it directly ties back to our earlier discussion about their investment in a universal, localized healthcare infrastructure.
The consultorios.
Exactly. When we talked about the neighborhood doctors, that is the first line of defense. But for maternal health, they take it a step further with an institution called Hogares Maternos, or maternity homes.
Wait, what exactly is a maternity home?
Okay, imagine a pregnant woman living in a highly rural area far from a major hospital.
Okay.
In many countries, if she develops a complication like preeclampsia, the sheer distance to the hospital could be a death sentence for her or the baby.
Because they just can't get there in time.
Right. In Cuba, if a neighborhood doctor identifies a high-risk pregnancy, maybe the mother has high blood pressure, or is carrying twins, or honestly simply lives too far from a delivery ward, she is proactively moved into a Hogar Materno weeks before her due date.
Oh, wow. So they physically relocate the risk.
Exactly. These homes are staffed by nurses and doctors, providing constant monitoring, proper nutrition, and immediate access to emergency care if needed.
That is a brilliant logistical solution to a medical problem.
It is. They remove the variables of distance, poor diet, and lack of monitoring. It's proof that saving lives at birth is largely a matter of proactive system design, not just sheer reactive wealth.
That is an incredible mechanism, but To maintain our impartiality and really respect the reality of the data, we have to look at the second half of this reproductive health metric.
Yes, we do.
And this is where the data gets complicated.
Yeah, the adolescent birth rate. This measures births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
Right.
In 2023, Cuba's rate is 48.7.
And the world average is 39.1.
Right.
So despite this incredible healthcare system, Cuba's rate of teen pregnancy is actually higher than the global average.
It is.
I have to push back here. How does that happen? If they have a doctor on every block and they are proactively monitoring pregnancies, why are so many teenagers having children?
This is exactly why diving deep into the data, rather than just skimming the headlines, is so rewarding for you as a listener. It exposes the limits of infrastructure.
What do you mean?
Well, if you look at the historical trend in our sources, Cuba's adolescent birth rate was actually much higher in the past. It dropped from around 78 in 1990 down to the low 40s in the mid-2000s. But recently it has crept back up to near 49.
So it's fluctuating, but it's still historically high compared to the world.
Right, and what this highlights is that societal issues are incredibly complex. An excellent, highly accessible medical infrastructure is fantastic at preventing maternal deaths. That is a biological crisis that medicine can solve. But a medical clinic alone cannot dictate cultural habits, behavioral norms, or the complex socioeconomic realities that influence teenage pregnancy.
You can provide the clinic, but you can't control human behavior.
Exactly. Factors like early marriage traditions, the desire for independence, or even a lack of economic mobility that might make early motherhood seem like, the only viable path to adult status.
Right.
These are cultural and economic frictions that a doctor cannot simply prescribe away.
Which is such a vital takeaway.
Yeah.
A great overall GII score of 0.3 can totally mask highly localized, complex challenges like a rising adolescent birth rate.
Right.
You cannot just look at the final grade on the report card. You have to look at the individual subject.
Precisely. Now let's move to the second component of the Gender Inequality Index, political empowerment.
Okay, so we're shifting from healthcare to power, policy, and decision-making.
Exactly.
So we have a population of highly educated women living longer lives. But does that actually translate to power? Like, are they just well-educated participants in the society, or are they actually writing the rules of the country?
That's the key question.
And this is where the data really pops. The primary metric here is the share of seats in the national parliament held by women. In 2023, Cuban women hold roughly 55.7% of parliamentary seats.
They hold the absolute majority. Now contrast that with the global average, which in 2023 is just 26.5%.
The global average is barely over a quarter, and Cuba is well over half.
And again, tracking the historical data shows the intentionality behind this. In 1990, female representation in Cuba's parliament was around 22.7%. Over 3 decades, they have more than doubled that representation to achieve and actually surpass absolute parity.
Wow.
They are one of the few countries on Earth where the parliament is fundamentally gender-balanced, actually tilting female.
I think about it like a corporate boardroom.
Okay.
It is one thing to be invited to sit in on the meeting and take notes.
Yeah.
It's another thing entirely when you literally hold the majority of the voting shares. When you control the majority of the votes, you control the agenda. I have to imagine that this top-level political empowerment is exactly what drives the funding and the intense focus on the health and education metrics we discussed earlier.
It absolutely is.
Because if women are making the laws that support maternity homes and female education are going to get passed.
Representation drives policy. When women have a defining voice in resource allocation, the societal priorities naturally shift to be more inclusive of the structural support women need.
Right.
Historically, organizations like the Federation of Cuban Women, or FMC, played a massive role in pushing for this representation. They ensured that women weren't just participating in the society, but actively governing the resulting state.
But wait, this brings up the third component of the GII, and I think it's going to complicate the picture again.
It usually does. What is it?
We see women dominating the classroom. We see them holding the majority in parliament. But what about the everyday workforce?
Yes, the labor market. Specifically, we look at the labor force participation rate, or LFPR, for individuals ages 15 and older.
Let's look at the 2023 numbers. Cuban women are participating in the labor force at a rate of 57.3%, which is noticeably higher than the global average for women, which is roughly 48.5%.
And that is the positive takeaway. They're beating the global average by almost 9 percentage points, which shows a strong societal push for female economic participation. But we have to look at the internal comparison. We have to compare Cuban women to Cuban men.
Right. And looking here, wow, Cuban men participate in the labor force at a massive 84.7%.
Yes.
Okay, let me just process that. So while Cuban women are beating the global average for female participation internally within their own country, there is still an almost 27 percentage point gap between men and women in the formal workforce.
This is the crucial reality check of the data. We've talked about all these incredible strides in education and top-level political power, but the labor market data grounds the discussion.
It really does.
It shows that no country, no matter how progressive its social policies might be on paper, has achieved total frictionless parity.
It really makes you wonder, though, why does this specific gap exist? If women have equal or better education, and they literally write the laws of the land, why are nearly 30% fewer women in the formal workforce compared to men?
It's a great question.
Is this just the universal invisible burden of unpaid domestic care rearing its head again?
It is highly likely yes, and it speaks to a deep, deep cultural friction. Across the globe, regardless of political systems, the expectation of unpaid care work, raising children, caring for elderly parents, maintaining the household, it falls disproportionately on women.
Universally.
Universally. And in Latin America, there is also the historical cultural concept of machismo, which traditionally places the man as the public provider and the woman as the domestic caretaker.
So even with a progressive state policy pushing for equality, you are still fighting against centuries of ingrained cultural norms.
Exactly. Even with high education and parliamentary representation, if the cultural expectation at the dinner table remains that the woman handles the domestic sphere, her participation in the formal labor market is always going to lag behind the man's.
Yeah.
The data here is a sobering reminder that state policy can only move as fast as the underlying culture allows. You can mandate equality in parliament, but you cannot easily legislate who does the laundry.
That is a fascinating tension between state policy and cultural reality. And, before we move off the economic realities, we really should touch on the multidimensional poverty index.
The MPI, yes.
Because we've established they have low income, but what does poverty actually look like there? The 2019 MPI data is super interesting.
It is. The MPI looks beyond just income and measures overlapping deprivations in health, education, and living standards.
Right, and Cuba's MPI value is incredibly low. It's 0.003. And the poverty incidence, is the percentage of the population actually in multidimensional poverty, is only 0.7%.
Less than 1%.
Yeah. But when you look at the contributors to that tiny amount of poverty, it's not a lack of electricity or a lack of schooling.
No, the data shows that housing quality contributes 13.7% to the poverty index, and a lack of assets contributes 12.5%.
So it's not starvation. It's degrading infrastructure.
Exactly. It's crumbling buildings and a lack of modern appliances, not a lack of basic human needs. They've optimized their limited resources almost to the absolute limit.
Okay, we need to pivot the conversation entirely now.
Where to?
We've established a really solid understanding of the human element here. Cuba has achieved high human development, especially in health and education, and they have impressively strong gender indices. But we have to ask the ultimate question of the 21st century. What is the cost to the planet?
The environmental cost of development. This is where the traditional development model usually just completely falls apart.
Exactly. Because historically, when a nation achieves high human development, they do it by burning a massive amount of fossil fuels, extracting raw materials, and leaving a giant carbon footprint.
All right, we associate long lives and high education with massive power grids and consumer consumption.
So what happens when we adjust Cuba's HDI for its environmental impact?
This brings us to a relatively new but incredibly important metric. The Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, the PHD.
Yes.
It takes a country's standard HDI score and discounts it based on two specific environmental factors: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
It's like looking at a corporation that is posting massive record-breaking profits, but then an auditor comes in and realizes they only achieve those profits by liquidating all their long-term assets, taking out massive unpayable loans, and dumping toxic waste in the river behind the factory.
That is a brilliant metaphor. The PHDI is the audit that exposes the true long-term cost of a country's development. It exposes the ecological debt a country is taking on.
Right.
So let's look at the audit for Cuba. Cuba's standard HDI for 2023 was 0.762, but their PHDI, their ecologically audited score, is 0.723.
Now, a drop is expected. Every country has some environmental footprint. But we have to look at the size of the discount. The difference between Cuba's regular HDI and their PHDI is only 5.1%.
Just 5.1%. To put that in perspective, the global average difference between HDI and PHDI is over 10%.
Double the drop.
Yes. Highly developed, wealthy nations, the ones we typically view as the absolute pinnacle of success, they often see massive double-digit percentage drops in their score when planetary pressures are factored in.
Because their lifestyles are deeply, fundamentally unsustainable.
Exactly.
Let's look at the specific emissions data from the sources. In 2023, Cuba's per capita carbon dioxide emissions were roughly 2.06 tons.
And the global average for that same year was 4.54 tons.
But Cuba's carbon footprint is less than half the global average, while they're maintaining a higher than average human development score.
That is wild.
And here's the most staggering statistic of this entire deep dive. It's the number that completely reframes the global hierarchy.
Lay it on me. When you adjust every single country's HDI for planetary pressures to create a global PHDI ranking, Cuba's global ranking jumps up by 28 positions.
Wait, 28 spots.
28 spots. It is one of the most significant upward leaps of any country on Earth.
It's like watching a marathon where the leaders are sprinting at an incredible pace, but they are all wearing lead boots and drinking salt water.
Yeah.
Eventually, the sheer unsustainability of their pace catches up with them, and the runner who is just pacing themselves, drinking water, and running efficiently suddenly breezes past 24 of them.
It is a profound shift in how we measure success. What this data implies is that the traditional definition of a highly developed nation might be mathematically flawed.
Or at least short-sighted.
Exactly. Traditional development has almost always been built on a foundation of massive carbon emissions and unsustainable material extraction. The Cuban sample, as we might call it, proves that it is mechanically possible to achieve high human development, long life expectancies, extensive education, high female political participation, without simultaneously exporting an ecological disaster to the rest of the globe.
It's a model of extreme efficiency.
Yeah.
But I have to address the elephant in the room.
Let's do it.
I have to play devil's advocate here because we cannot ignore the economic reality of the people living there. We have to look at the GNI data again because there is a very real bottleneck happening.
The income paradox.
Yes. We mentioned at the top that the total GNI per capita sits at just $8,450 for 2023. And if you look specifically at female GNI per capita, it has historically lagged even further behind. Looking at the data from 2021, before that specific gender split data line cuts off in our sources, female GNI was roughly $5,994, while male GNI was roughly double that. And compared to the world average for women, which is almost $15,000, it's very low.
And this raises the central defining bottleneck of this entire model. They have these incredible social indicators and an incredibly sustainable environmental footprint. But if you look closely at the HDI timeline, their overall growth has kind of stagnated recently.
Yeah, it plateaued in the mid-760s for several years.
Because there's only so much you can achieve without raw capital. You can build the clinic and you can train the doctor, but eventually you need to buy the MRI machine. You need to import the raw materials for medicine.
Right. Cuba currently exists in a highly unusual statistical quadrant: high social development, low economic income.
Exactly. The lack of economic growth, which is severely hampered by international sanctions and limited access to global trade, creates a hard ceiling on what they can achieve.
So I have to ask you this, and I want you to be brutally honest based on the data. Is this low-income constraint actually the secret to their low planetary footprint?
Like, is their environmental sustainability simply forced upon them? If tomorrow they suddenly discovered massive, easily extractable oil reserves and had the wealth of a G7 nation, would their carbon emissions skyrocket? Would they just become another massive polluter burning up the atmosphere?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question for global climate policy right now. Is there sustainability in intentional structural design, or is it merely a byproduct of economic starvation?
Right. Are they green because they want to be, or green because they can't afford to be anything else?
The frustrating truth is that the data can only show us what is, not what would be under different circumstances.
However.
Yes. If we look at the patterns, the extreme intentionality we saw in how they distribute education equitably and how they structured political power to include women, it suggests a system that fundamentally prioritizes human capability over sheer consumption.
That makes sense.
Yes, their low emissions are undoubtedly tied to their low industrial output and lack of consumer goods, but their high human development is tied to highly intentional policy choices. So, Synthesizing all this vast amount of data we've unpacked today, what is the real takeaway for the listener? The Cuban sample proves that you don't need to be wealthy to be healthy, educated, and relatively equal.
Right. High efficiency in these areas can be achieved through deliberate social prioritization rather than raw wealth.
It proves that the correlation between money and human well-being is not a strict one-to-one ratio. A nation doesn't have to wait until it is rich to take care of its citizens.
Exactly. Policy choices, equitable resource allocation, and a focus on preventative localized systems can dramatically outperform raw economic output.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on. For you listening, think about this. If human well-being, living a long life, being educated, having a political voice, doesn't inherently require massive wealth, and if massive wealth almost always destroys the planet's ecological balance, shouldn't the rest of the developed world be looking at how to decouple living well from consuming endlessly?
It really is the defining challenge of our era. Can we maintain the life expectancy and the educational infrastructure of the global north, but aggressively reduce our planetary footprint to match the global south?
Can the massive gas-guzzling nations learn something from the highly efficient, stripped-down model that just passed them in the endurance race?
It's a profound question, and one the data insists we start trying to answer.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers. We hope it gave you a new perspective on what development actually means, and we encourage you to keep questioning the metrics that define our world.